All right, document 32A, sexualization of society. The tendency is for society to become sexualized, for people to think of everything in sexual terms. The powerful procreative drive becomes misused. As we're born and we're these little tiny people, we are boys or girls. And as we grow up, the sexuality in our lives starts out, I like to think, as a little stream in the mountain, which becomes a bigger river into the valleys, and eventually runs against a dam. And that dam is called marriage. Okay? Dam is called marriage. As long as that dam is there and it holds back the increasing depth and force of our sexuality, as long as that dam is there, it's controlled. Okay? So the procreative drive can be misused if this dam is allowed to break, which is what's going on in societies. Then the sexuality, instead of becoming focused between a husband and a wife, it gets diffused among so many people, and it gets out of control. Okay? So we want to make sure that the dam of marriage is kept there. Do you understand what I mean when I say the dam of marriage? Marriage is many things, but one thing it is, it's a way of regulating the sexual energies in the society. They're focused on one person. We looked at that from the scripture last week. We looked at 1 Corinthians 7:4. A wife does not have power of her own body, but her husband does. Husband does not have power of his own body, but his wife does. And so our sexuality is not something for us to just spread it everywhere. It's something for us to focus behind the dam that God has placed there. Okay, to use a simple illustration. When that happens, it becomes difficult or impossible for men and women to view or think of each other as whole persons, but rather to think of themselves and others just as sexual objects. This objectification reduces persons to bodies without other more important considerations. So pornography, for example, is simplistic. The person's a body. That's it. It's just a body. A real person is a lot more than a body. But the objectification reduces us down to one part. This is really, really wrong. Okay? Such objectification reduces persons to bodies without other more important considerations. The innate God-given drives are exploited for profits. So, as I said before, whether they're trying to sell me toothpaste or a truck, there's probably going to be a picture of a girl there somewhere, right? You know, how silly is this, really? But does it work? It works. Why does it work? Because of the hyperstimulation that people are looking for. So that's what's going to make a man look at the picture of the truck. All right. Now, if we're people who are controlled by the Spirit of God, and we're people who are processing life through the Scripture, we should be able to see that that's a decoy. We should be able to tell that that egg underneath this bird is not a real egg, even though it looks nice and it's bigger than the others and is painted brightly. It's not. We should be able to tell that the candy bar is not going to nourish our bodies like the apple will. Okay. So we've got to be people who have discernment. Without the discernment, we're going to go to those hyperstimulations. So while we're on this subject, we might as well talk a little bit more about it. In the current society, several factors have influenced this process. And I say 1950 to the 2000s, at the end of World War II and during World War II, 1939 to 1945, you had a total change in the way people thought of themselves and the way people worked. You probably heard of Rosie the Riveter. Anybody ever heard of that? The people who built the airplanes, the ladies. Men are off to war. The ladies are building airplanes, flying airplanes. They had pictures of women driving tractors in the agricultural ads. Why? Because the men were off to war. Buy a new tractor because a Farmall H is easier to drive than an old Fordson with a steering wheel is made out of iron and couldn't be driven by a woman. Now you can drive a tractor that's easier to drive. Of course, they still didn't have power steering, but for the 1950s, this was the way to go. So women started wearing trousers instead of skirts, and they started working outside the home. And so things started changing dramatically, and this is not really a sociology class. So let's take a look at our notes here. Gender as primary personal identity becomes sexual attractiveness. And we talked about gender prior to this time. So gender is the way we perceive ourselves as feminine and masculine, and it's very important we do that. And we said that when people lose the femininity, they turn to femaleness, right? When people lose their masculinity, they turn to maleness. And then we're these big macho guys who run over everybody, where a real masculine man is kind and gentle, although still strong. So when we lose the primary identity, then we turn to the sexual attractiveness, and we make ourselves sexually attractive instead of thinking of self as a meaningful part of society, instead of total integrity. So we reduce everything to just, how do I look? Does this enhance my appearance? Does this make me look more male or more female? Women in the workplace causes stress at home. Most productive hours spent away from home. The demands of business to be attractive in appearance and behavior, and I'm talking generally about the society, but what happens in society eventually tends to find its way into the church somehow. And so when you think about a woman who works in the workplace, could even be as a school teacher, and I'm not saying you can't do that. My wife taught school many years, but we have to be careful that those most productive hours that are spent away from home, in which we're all dressed up and we look pretty, and then we come home, we need to bring some of that home too, okay? If you're just doing that in the workplace and you come home, and that's where everything starts falling apart. We got to be really, really careful. Demands of business, the work spouse, co-worker is available to meet needs during work hours while also having a spouse and family at home. This is very common, not in our circles, hopefully, but it's very common in the world, that somebody will have a work spouse. Here's somebody you work with. I mean, I have a friend who does counseling, and they travel, and he travels with a woman who's not his wife. Okay? That becomes a work spouse. Because this is a person you interact with every day. You drive side by side in the vehicle, you counsel side by side in people's homes and wherever you go. That person becomes the work spouse, okay? And we have to be careful about that. Even teaching in a Christian school, a man as a principal, ladies as teachers, it's important that we don't allow these things to become part of our thinking, okay? Make sure that we have our boundaries at the right place. Birth control methods has separated sexual activity from procreation. Sexual activity then is seen as recreational with no commitment required. Allows women the same sexual freedom as men, has been exploited by feminism. I know it's a sensitive subject, but unfortunately, these are things we do need to talk about, because after a while, like I said, the world's thinking processes start becoming part of our thinking processes. The media, television, shows and advertisements, I just find these things so destructive. And I've never watched the Super Bowl, by the way. But one of my friends did, I think 2 years ago. His buddies were always saying, come watch the Super Bowl. He said, I finally went. I said, well, how was it? He said, I think men watch it to watch the ads. He said, those ads, some of them are so sleazy and so captivating. He said, I can't even get them out of my mind now. So, we have to be careful that not only the shows and the way they're portraying people, but the advertisements. And the duplicity, the way TV and movies are talking out of both sides of their mouth. First of all, they're saying, just because we present something and depict something, that won't change people's behavior. They don't want to take responsibility for changing people's behavior. At the same time, they're selling ads to change people's behavior. Now, I'll let you figure that one out, okay? Movies and videos set the standards for sexual activity, the objectification of women. How are women pictured in movies? And in almost anything on the screen. They're typically pictured as objects. What about men? Some men are pictured as objects. Fathers are often depicted, I'm told, as people who don't know what they're doing, and mom's in charge. Is this really going to take us closer to God's ideal for the family? Desensitizes viewers to unacceptable behaviors, language. Actors and actresses become role models. The role models that I'm seeing, even in our circles, not just so much actors and actresses, but many times athletes, professional athletes. I remember I saw when I was the principal of school, a young man opened the door. He had on his locker, he opened the door. He had a huge picture of a professional athlete right there inside in a Christian school, right inside the locker door. So where does this come from? These people become role models. Even on the radio, there are shock programs. And by the way, as you talk about things like this, I'm trying to be careful not to introduce people to things that they don't know about, because, teaching about something can be a way of spreading problems. So I try to be really careful about that. Even some of the books that are out there trying to teach us not to get involved in sin sometimes depict sin a little too graphically. Okay? Too graphically for me. There are things in some of these books that I read some years ago, I'm on a little detour here, but like Every Man's Battle, Every Young Man's Battle, and so on. There's a whole set of books like that. I read them, put them on my bookshelf last year. I pulled them off again and read them again because I wanted to see. And I understand they're used as textbooks in some of our Bible schools and so on, and I know they're for sale almost everywhere. But there are things in those books I could not stand here and read to you without an incredible amount of embarrassment. Okay? Things that conjure up images in my mind, I really don't want there. I really don't want them there. Now, if I happen upon an image going to a place of business and somebody's got a calendar on the wall, or somebody's dressed inappropriately in my presence, those are things I did not look for, I did not seek. I encountered them. I've got to know how to deal with that. But, to present something that gives images that are harmful to me, I personally have to keep those things out of my life. Fads and styles dictate appearance and behavior. Displaying underwear. I mean, there was an article in the Lancaster paper a couple of years ago that even in some of the Mennonite schools, some of the students are doing this kind of behavior. Okay, it was a gripping and sad story. Displaying underwear, trousers hung below boxers. I mean, if you go through cities, they're actually starting to make rules, secular rules against this kind of behavior. Skirts that look like slips. I know this is embarrassing, but I don't know how else to deal with it. Okay. Public appearance in PJs. There was sort of a fad there for a little bit. People going to the store in PJs. I was actually at a young people's gathering one time, and one of the guys came in his PJs. Okay. Like, I was literally aghast. I wasn't responsible, and I think somebody did eventually do something about it. But public appearance in PJs, which is telling you just got out of or you're just ready to jump into bed. The wet hair look, which isn't so popular these days, but like I just got out of the shower. I understand fads come and go. I understand. But let's think about it. Let's process what's happening. Let's not just jump into a fad because it's cool. It may have some messages we really don't want to send. Loss of societal structure. The home, broken home, single parent. The parents not home when children come home from school. It used to be that if young people wanted to get involved in sexual activity, they had to find some place to go or do. It hasn't been true for maybe 20 years now because both parents are working. So when children get out of school, they can go to somebody's house. I'm talking not in our circles, hopefully, but they go to somebody's house and there's nobody there. The house is open. There's nobody home. There they are. Schools, because people are out of control, the school has become a national parent. In the public arena, the school has become the parent. The TV, on the next page, has become the babysitter. So now we don't need parents anymore. Even further than that, I'm not sure if I had mentioned this here or not, but schools, even in my days in public school, we got hot lunch at school. Now you can get breakfast at school. And now there's babysitting after school for the parents so when school's over, you stay there in public schools until the parents come at 5 or 6 o'clock to pick you up. So the school has become the parent. And we have to be careful this doesn't happen. And just another aside here, as a school principal and now as a school instructor, we have to be careful that we don't take the role of the parents away from them. We have parents in this room right now. We had parents visiting some time ago, and they said, "Are we allowed in the classroom?" I said, "Parents are always not only allowed, but welcome in my classroom." Why? We're working for the parents. They have allowed us time to teach the students, okay? They're not my students. I don't have a right to think of them. I mean, they are my students because I'm responsible, but they're not my students in that I have no right to do something that of which their parents would not approve. So I try to be very careful with that. And so even in Mennonite schools, what we've discovered is, I'm on a little bit of a school detour here, but what we've discovered is that the school can very quickly become the default. Oh, we can't handle her at home. Maybe you can do something with her at school. That's not going to be good for the school. This boy we can't control at home. Can you do something for him at school? Mr. Reed, could you take our son in here because he's really struggling? Well, if it's a behavior issue, what am I supposed to do that the parents can't do? And sometimes we do. But the schools can quickly become the default institutions. Even sometimes the churches are asking the schools to control somebody that the churches can't seem to control. Let's be really careful. And whenever I speak about this at places like Faith Builders and other places, that I say, be sure you don't become the default parent when the church is really responsible and the parents are really responsible. Okay, we want to be part of that, but we don't want to be the last line of defense. We want to be here to try and bring instruction. So in a neighborhood, people live as individuals instead of as communities. And as I told you before, people who live in big apartment buildings, they all come out their doors into a lobby and don't even talk to each other. They walk out. They live so close together that the only way to maintain any idea of separateness or the only way to attain and maintain some identity is not to make contact. Or if you live out in the country, and you drive past your neighbor and they're out, you wave, okay? Because you're trying to make contact. When you get so physically close, you try not to make contact just to maintain an identity. Loss of societal structure requires an added emphasis and demands on internal personal structure. So when we don't have societal structure, whether it's in the school, the church, the home, that means the structure has to be in here or it's nowhere. Classic illustration, the paddles that used to hang up at the corner of the blackboard in public schools. That's external structure, okay? Today, the paddles are gone, and if the student does not have internal structure, there's no structure. So we need to build into people internal structure, particularly in Christian homes. We need to build that internal structure. And the loss of role models, I'm in a discussion right now on church leadership with some men, and our question is, where are the role models? Can we find role models? Who are they? Who are the role models by which the young leaders can say, here's the way to live. Here's the way to direct the church. Here's the way to shepherd the flock. We desperately need those role models. Absolutely desperately need them. And if we don't have them, life is not going to go well. So I wanted to say one more thing about broken homes, and that is part of the sexualization of society is the broken home. If you grew up in a home where dad and mom lived together, not a perfect home, dad and mom and the children lived together, not perfect, but dad and mom are there. Dad milks the cows, drives the truck, goes to work. Mom bakes cookies, makes lunch, okay? You don't think of your parents as sexual creatures. You think of dad as a protector, provider, mother as a nurturer, supporter, okay? That's the way we think. If you are a child living out in the world and you're in a broken home and dad's gone, you might not even know who he is, and mom has boyfriends, guess what? You start thinking of your parents as sexual creatures. And this is totally changing the mindset of the next generation. Mom's not a nurturer. Dad's not a provider. Okay? He's running around with some girlfriends. Mom has a series of boyfriends. Okay? Absolutely destroying the fabric of the society. Or even if they're not godly men and godly women, at least they're men of integrity and women of integrity who live together, take care of the family. That's essentially gone. So we have a major external control that's missing. And then how do you build into that child an internal control or an internal structure when a major external control that God's put there, a major external structure that God's put there, the family has now disintegrated. Okay. And it changes the way you view the adults in your life. If you have document 32 and on page 5, I address the subject of homosexuality. So sorry if you don't have it with you, but we haven't gotten to it yet. But here are the ways I've looked at the subject of homosexuality, male homosexuality, and the way it happens. Many times there's a distant father who's uninvolved in the life, okay, an aggressive mother, and sometimes it provides a fear of women. So mom's aggressive, she's kind of rough on dad, she might be rough on the son, and the son gets this fear of women where he's going to feel safe with a man. And so it's very often happened. Need for same-sex closeness. If dad and son are not close and not bonded, and the son has this need for same-sex closeness, and we do. I saw my sons over the weekend, give them a hug. You know, that's close. I love my sons and my little grandsons. You know, I want them to learn safe same-sex closeness. Okay? When that doesn't exist, something happens, and you have to understand, this is my understanding of it. I know I'm not politically correct. All right? But what it appears to me, and the way I've seen it explained by Christian counselors, is that as men, we look at women, as godly men, we look at godly women as something of a mystery. Amen, brothers? Okay. Women are something of a mystery. Okay. Not always just something of a mystery, sometimes a complete mystery. But many times men who have homosexual behaviors don't see women as a mystery. They can understand the way women think. They can identify with women. To them, men are a mystery. Do you hear what I said? To men who have homosexual tendencies and behaviors, instead of thinking of women as a mystery, they'll tend to think of men as a mystery. And so just as a heterosexual man is always trying to figure out his sisters and his mother and his wife, a homosexual-oriented man is always trying to figure out the men and his father and all the other men out there. And it provides an attraction that's not natural because it was not met earlier in life. Okay, I'm not trying to defend it. You ask the questions, okay? Not develop manhood, and so they seek it in another man. Introduction to homosexual practices when they were a child, maybe, by a boy or another man. Willingness to trade sex for closeness and acceptance. Maybe they don't feel accepted. And here comes a man who has a homosexual lifestyle. And as a result of that homosexual lifestyle, this man is willing to give his body just to feel close to somebody. Okay? And many times it's very revolting initially, but after a while he becomes willing to exchange access to his body because somebody cares for him. There's an initial sexual experience that can produce fixation or reference for the future. Many times, initial sexual experiences that we have become very fixating. And if it was a homosexual experience, this is not always true, but it can be true, that early homosexual experience where another man has abused a boy, that will become a fixation from which he will find it very difficult to escape. And some of these people, you may think of people like this, who grow up, get married, and then realize they thought that getting married would cure their homosexual tendencies, but it doesn't, and actually break the marriage and begin a homosexual lifestyle. Typically, a very, very difficult subject, especially in our lives today, because homosexuality has now become a political issue and a medical issue, and so there's all kinds of attempts at explaining it. Romans 1 deals with this, okay? Romans chapter 1 deals with the subject fairly extensively. Why don't we take a look at it? In Romans chapter 1, and there would be other places to turn, but let's, in the closing moments of the class, look at Romans 1. Romans 1 is dealing with creation and nature, and then what he does here, what Paul does in Romans 1, is takes a look at God and the way people live, and he talks about what's revealed by God to people. In verse 19 of Romans 1, because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has showed it to them. There's a natural revelation of God to people. Okay? Romans 1:19. And so on. For the invisible things, Romans 1:20, of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things which are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. In other words, when people look at nature and creation, they are without excuse if they don't accept it. Okay? And of course, immediately, if we have men living with men and women living with women, and there's no cross-gender lifestyles, there won't be any more children, okay? There won't be any more procreation, and God has planned that in the natural world. And notice, in the interest of time, I think if you look at verse 23, they changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made unto like corruptible man. And so on, verse 24, wherefore God gave them up. 3 times in this chapter, you're going to see this. That's the first one. You can underline those words, God gave them up. When you don't accept what God has shown you in creation and from his own glory, God will give you up. Verse 24, wherefore God has given them up to uncleanness through the lusts of their own hearts, to dishonor their own bodies between themselves. Is that what we're talking about? Who changed the truth of God into a lie. A creation does not indicate that we should live homosexual lifestyles. Creation indicates that we should live heterosexual lifestyles. And serve the creature more than the creator, who's blessed forever. Verse 26, for this cause God gave them up. You see it again? That's the second time he says he gave them up. Unto vile affections, for even their women did change their natural use into that which is against nature. Likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burn in their lust one toward another. Men with men, working that which is unseemly, receiving in themselves the recompense of the error which is a meat. So there we have expressed exactly what happens in homosexual behavior. And in verse 28, even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over. So 3 times here he says, I gave them up, I gave them up, I gave them over. So when you don't recognize God, the way he's done things, the way he wants things done, he will start releasing you to your own sin and your own devices, which is exactly what is happening in Romans 1.